government to capture enemy commerce. In the case of Britain, the enemies are France and Spain. So when he goes to London, he meets a lot of important people, including the Earl of Bellamont, a member of Parliament who later becomes the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then later governor of New York. Bellamont supports Kidd's initiative and even becomes his business partner. So Kidd outfits a ship called the Adventure Galley and sails off to the Indian Ocean. And in May of 1698, the vessel reaches Madagascar, at which point 90 of the 150 men on the crew desert, and Kidd decides to abandon his deteriorated ship. There's an altercation with the crew, which comes back to haunt him later. So what Kidd decides to do is he captures a Moorish trading vessel called the Quetta Merchant and sails off to the West Indies and the Caribbean. In the meantime, the British government decides that the Quetta Merchant wasn't a legitimate prize, was not an enemy vessel, and they declare that Kidd is now a pirate and rather than a privateer. Bellamont, meanwhile, has moved off to Massachusetts to be governor, and he declares war on pirates, including his former business partner. And he takes a very dim view of Long Island. He says, he writes in May of 1699, that the inhabitants of Long Island were a, quote, lawless and desperate people, close quote, who protected the pirates who were, quote, settled among them. And as the governor, he wants to collect taxes from the English colonists on eastern Long Island, and says he can't find anybody honest enough to do it because they're all either corrupt or in league with the pirates. And he writes, many of them have been pirates themselves. So he has to send tax collectors down from Massachusetts to collect duties from people on Long Island. So meanwhile, Kidd learns that the British government has declared him a pirate. So he transfers some of his treasure to a sloop called the St. Anthony, and he sails for New England to try to resolve his problems with the governor. But he's also nervous that he won't be able to resolve these problems and he would still be in trouble. So he stops in Oyster Bay and hires a local attorney named James Emmett and sends him off to negotiate with the governor on his behalf. To sweeten the deal, Kidd also sends along some jewelry for the governor's wife, but it doesn't ultimately work. Meanwhile, Kidd sails back out east to Gardiner's Island and makes an arrangement with Jonathan Gardner, the current owner of the island, to bury all of his treasure there for safekeeping while he tries to get untangled from his legal problems. So this is a famous painting of Kidd burying treasure on Gardiner's Island. And they make a deal with Gardner. They give him a large silk fabric, which is pretty valuable, in return for letting them bury the treasure on the island, which they do a half-mile in from the western shoreline. This is a marker that the family later puts up on the site. Kidd marked it with a pile of rocks called a cairn. So after taking this precaution, Kidd sails off to Boston, carrying what he thinks is concrete proof showing that the Quetta Merchant was a legitimate prize and he's not really a pirate. The government doesn't believe him. Bellamont has him seized as soon as he arrives on July 6th, then sends a messenger to Gardiner's Island with orders to retrieve all of the buried treasure from Jonathan Gardner, and Gardner cooperates. And he gives a statement to the governor's representative saying that the day that he buried the treasure, Kidd convinced him to, quote, take 3 Negroes, 2 boys and a girl ashore to keep till he, the said Kidd, should call for them. Gardner said the captain had given him cloth and 4 pieces of Arabian gold and had buried a chest and a box of gold, a bundle of quilts, and 4 bales of good. In addition, 2 members of Captain Kidd's crew gave him 2 bags of silver, which weighed about 30 pounds, a small bundle of gold dust of about a pound weight, a sash, and a pair of worsted stockings. So Bellamont has all the treasure as far as he can tell. The Gardner family held on to the silk fabric, some of which you can still see mounted on the wall of the manor house out on Gardiner's Island if you're lucky enough to take a tour like I was for Newsday. So Kidd is sent off to London in chains for trial. And in February of 1700, he's charged with murdering one of his crewmen, William Moore, during the mutiny in Madagascar. Two of the deserters from his crew testify against him, and he's convicted and sentenced to hang for the murder. And if that's not bad enough, he's then tried for piracy and convicted on that charge as well. So he's taken to the gallows on the banks of the Thames, and is a contemporary illustration. When they take him up on the gallows and drop the trapdoor, the rope breaks. In some cultures, that's considered an omen, and they let the condemned man go free. But England is not one of those cultures. So they march him back up the steps, put a new rope around him, and hang him a second time. This time, the rope holds Kidd's, strangles or breaks his neck. And then they put him up on this gibbet on the banks of the Seine, the banks of the Thames, and leave his body there to rot as a message to other would-be pirates about what would happen to them. So there's a corollary to the Kidd story, which is the other major pirate story on Long Island, which is a pirate who's less known named Joseph Radish. This is actually a cigar box image of him, which is the best we have, which reflects contemporary descriptions of him, and as being squint-eyed with a marked face and a kind of scary countenance. So Radish also goes to the gallows alongside Kidd and takes the ride from the New World to London in the same ship. He almost ends up taking one of the most influential citizens of Southampton, Colonel Henry Pearson, who's a member of the militia and a local big shot, with him. So Radish is born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1672. In 1698, when he's 25, he sails for London and goes out on a ship as a boatswain's mate on a trading ship heading for Borneo. 6 months later, they land for water on an island off of the coast of India. Part of the crew seizes the ship, leaving the captain and his officers on the beach. They sail away, and the mutineers elect Radish as their captain. He splits up all the treasure and cargo on board, and then they sail for North America. Nobody knows much about them until one morning of March in 1699, when Colonel Pearson, as a member of the Colonial Assembly, looks out the window of his house in Sagaponack and sees this strange ship sailing back and forth off the shore. Not knowing what's going on and being a local dignitary, he gets a few of his friends together. They get a rowboat and they go out to see what's going on, and they meet Radish. And Radish tells them that he's on his way to Philadelphia, but he needs water and other provisions. So as the local leader, Pearson agrees to help him. And he and Reverend Ebenezer White of Sagaponack, who's a minister at a church in Bridgehampton, ride with Radish to East Hampton to make arrangements for provisions. And they meet with John Mulford, a leading citizen, make arrangements for what they need. Then they ride back to Sagaponack. The next morning, Radish goes back to the ship, comes ashore again the next morning with 4 big sealed bags. 3 contain money and 1 contain jewels, but Pearson doesn't know what's in them. Radish asked Pearson if he will just hold on to them for safekeeping, and Pearson agrees to help him as a good citizen. And for his trouble, Radish gives Pearson 2 small guns, a cask of powder, a jewel, and a small bag of pieces of 8. So Radish then sails east out off the coast of East Hampton and anchors there for a few days, while Pearson goes with Radish to hire 3 ships, 3 small sloops, and the plan is to divide up the cargo from the bigger ship onto these 3 smaller sloops and disperse. So meanwhile, the people in East Hampton are getting suspicious, and they go out. Radish is ashore making arrangements, and they question the first mate, who says they're a slaver, which they don't believe because there's no evidence that slaves have ever been carried on that ship. Meanwhile, Radish hires Samuel Hand, a local ship's pilot, to guide his ship out to Gardiner's Island, where they're supposed to rendezvous with the 3 sloops and divvy up the loot. The wind isn't good to go to Garden's Island. So instead they rendezvous at Block Island and divide up the loot. And then Radish sinks his ship either to hide his tracks or because the ship was badly deteriorated. So the pirates scatter on their 3 ships. And for some reason, Radish and 10 of his men go to Massachusetts to see the governor. Maybe he thinks he can persuade the governor that he's not really a pirate, just like Kidd was trying to do. He has the same luck as Kidd. He's arrested and thrown in jail. He has the one advantage over Kidd, which is the jail keeper is a relative who allows him to escape. The governor is incensed, puts a 200-pound reward for Bradish's recapture, which quickly brings him back to the jail. Then he's sent off with Kidd in irons to London for trial, and the result is the same. He's put up on the gallows. His rope doesn't break, so he dies on the first attempt, and he's hanged in chains on the dock until his body rots away also. So meanwhile, Pearson has his own legal trouble because one of his neighbors has ratted him out to the governor, saying he's in league with the pirates. The authorities come and question him, and Pearson's trying to persuade him he's just being a good citizen to a visitor. Luckily, he's got a lot of important friends, and they all persuade the governor's representatives that Pearson didn't know what was going on. Pearson turns over all the bags with the goodies, and he's allowed to go free. But he probably came pretty close to ending up on the gallows himself. So ever since this episode in 1699, people, just like people think Captain Kidd still has buried treasure somewhere around Long Island, people think that Bradish still left behind buried treasure on Block Island or on the east end of Long Island. In particular interest to these treasure hunter types is a pond at the base of the Montauk Lighthouse, which has been nicknamed the Money Pond because Bradish was supposedly left some treasure buried, left in the water of that pond. Nobody's ever found any treasure in the pond, and people have been searching for the wreck of his ship ever since, and they haven't found that either. So the piracy sort of dies out in the early 1700s because the British authorities really just put a lot of effort into catching and stamping out piracy. But at the same time, there's a lot of smuggling going on. People want to bring prohibited goods in and out into New York. They want to bring legal goods in, but not pay the tariffs to the British government. So there's a lot of smuggling. There's also a lot of smuggling going back and forth across Long Island Sound because people want to trade with Connecticut and don't want to deal with the government and paying taxes. So the smuggling continues pretty much uninterrupted right through the colonial period and right through the Revolution. These are not big name pirates. These are just sort of small fry trying to make a few bucks. The one name that stands out among these small smugglers is Abraham Woodhull, here in Setauket, and the name may be familiar because he becomes the chief spy of the Culper spy ring that helps George Washington win the American Revolution. And this happens to be the subject of my next book, which will be out in May, the true story of the Culper spy ring. So Woodhull is a Setauket farmer, not particularly prosperous, but what he does is he will load up, he will sell his farm produce in the city, buy British goods, and then sell them in Connecticut in violation of all the trading regulations. And he does okay for a while. And then when the revolution breaks out, he's still doing it. And at this point, both the British and American Patriot vessels are patrolling the Sound looking for smugglers and military raiders. So a Patriot sloop out of Connecticut captures the boat that Woodhull is on and arrests him for smuggling. And he's thrown into jail, and he might have spent the rest of the Revolution there, except he's got important friends, particularly in Setauket. Most importantly, this gentleman, Benjamin Talmadge, who was from Setauket, and then when the war breaks out, goes to Connecticut and joins a cavalry regiment. And their childhood friends. Talmadge is a rising star in the army, ultimately becomes the spy master for the Culper spy ring. Talmadge goes to the Governor Trumbull in Connecticut and vouches for Woodhull, and he's freed. And before Woodhull can go back across the Sound, Talmadge tells him they're going to start. He's been charged by George Washington to start a spy ring, and he wants people he trusts, and he trusts Abraham Woodhull, who agrees to be the first or second spy from the Copper Ring, but basically becomes the chief spy for the duration of the war from 1778 through the end of the war in 1783. So Talmadge tells Washington that he's found his first chief spy. Washington likes the idea of a smuggler. He thinks it's perfect cover for being a spy, because Talmadge wants Woodhull to stop smuggling because he thinks it'll jeopardize the spy operation. But Washington said, no, it's perfect cover. But Washington's also concerned that somebody like Woodhull might have more of a profit motive than patriotism at heart. So he tells Talmadge to vet him carefully, because some smuggler spies would be, quote, more interested in their own amusement than to the business with which they are charged. And he tells Talmadge to take proper measures to curb this extravagant passion for gain. But since they've been childhood friends, Talmadge tells the general that Woodhull is a patriot, and he's not really trying to make money. He's trying to help the revolutionary cause. So the messages that Woodhull and later Robert Townsend send from Long Island to Connecticut to get to Washington north of the city are carried by Caleb Brewster, another childhood friend who's a whaleboat captain on the Sound. And you can see him here on the right in this 1950s mural from the Setauket School. So the Brewster, runs his whaleboat, and it becomes not only the chief cross-sound courier, but also intercepts a lot of British vessels and raiders and privateers on the Sound. What's interesting is one of his best friends was a smuggler. After the war, the government in 1790, at the suggestion of Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, forms what they call the Revenue Marine, which is basically a forerunner of the Coast Guard, charged with stopping smuggling and collecting tariffs. And one of the first captains of the Revenue Marine is Caleb Brewster. So he does that for many years after the Revolution. So smuggling at this point sort of dies out, because the Revenue Marine is fairly effective, and people have to sort of go through the customs houses when they're bringing goods in or out of Long Island. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead to the 1920s, and smuggling becomes another much bigger issue than it was in the colonial time. And that's because the government decides to attempt prohibition and ban the sale and consumption of alcohol. This unleashes a period of total chaos and legal troubles on Long Island, because this is an ill-fated experiment. So the Long Island becomes important again, because New York is the major population center and the biggest city in the country. People want to drink despite prohibition, and how not better to get stuff into the city but by bringing ashore on these deserted beaches and coves and rivers on Long Island. So in the Volstead Act is passed in 1920, a year after the 18th Amendment bans alcohol, and the enforcement starts out with a small cadre of prohibition agents, and they would often work with local police. And you see scenes like this, which is Nassau County Police breaking up tubs of legal booze in Long Beach. But in the beginning, there's a lot more rum runners and smugglers than there are prohibition agents, so things get pretty wild. But you have 13 years of rum running activity on Long Island, probably more than Long Island than any place else in the country, again, because of those 1,180 miles of coastline. And the other factor that makes Long Island popular for rum runners is there are lots of corrupt politicians, corrupt police, and even corrupt Coast Guardsmen who would either look the other way or in some cases actually help transport the booze. So the New York and Long Island and the country is in a kind of weird situation. We have prohibition, but Canada, the Bahamas, and Europe and everybody else does not. So you can have all the booze you want in Canada or the Bahamas. Long Island and the US has a 3-mile territorial limit. If you're 3.1 miles off the coast, you can sit there with all the booze in the world and it's perfectly legal. And this idea sort of becomes a major light bulb, going off in the heads of potential smugglers who realize they can bring the booze right outside the territorial limit, and then people will come out and bring it to shore, and they'll be the ones risking law enforcement wrath. So the first person to really take advantage of this situation is this gentleman named William McCoy. He and his brother ran a boat building business in Florida until it went bankrupt. So McCoy is looking for a new way to make money. And he thinks, well, I can buy booze out in the Bahamas, not that far from where he is in Florida, sell it up to just off the shore of Long Island and sell it for a huge profit. So he decides to do that. And he does it with a small boat and makes $15,000 profit on his first trip, which is enough to buy this large schooner called the Arethusa, at which point he's now bringing much bigger cargoes right off the coast. He's the first, but a lot of other people see what he's doing and get the same idea. And you get this weird situation where all these boats are anchored right off the 3-mile limit with signs in their rigging advertising what you can buy at what price. So the area quickly gets nicknamed Rum Row because of all these booze boats out there. The McCoy is the first, and he's also the most organized. He ends up buying a fleet of sailboats and then freighters, and he's doing major league business. As more people start to come out there, he realized that there's going to be people interested in not bringing in their own booze, but stealing his. So he has a machine gun set up on the deck of Arethusa just to dissuade people from bothering getting in the way of doing his business. The competitors say, well, we can make even more money if we water down the booze because, this is sort of a seller's market and they'll have to take what they can get. McCoy thinks that's a stupid business model because if he sells watered down booze, people will go elsewhere. So he makes a point and he tells people that when they buy booze from him, it's always unadulterated. So people gravitate to him because they want to get the real McCoy. And that phrase is still used today. And it's basically named after this gentleman you see here on the screen. So he's carrying, with the schooner, he's carrying 5,000 cases of liquor per trip, making 50 grand on each trip. So as I said, he uses that. He buys 5 more boats, hires more crew. He's turning this into a major business. Unfortunately, he attracts a lot of attention, not only from customers, but from the federal government. And it's not clear how they could arrest him because he's out in territorial water, but they come up with some charges of conspiracy and they arrest him in 1923. But he's already something of a folk hero. Even a lot of the people in the government like him. He's got a good personality. People like him. A lot of people respect what he's done. I think he's sort of like a Robin Hood. So he's tried and convicted, but a lot of the government people, are working on his side. So he's sentenced to 9 months in prison. But because of his connections, he's able to serve the 9 months in the local jail rather than going to prison. And they give him the special treatment of he can leave every morning and go about his business as long as the business isn't rum running, as long as he's back in the jail by 9 p.m. So he does this for 9 months, gives up rum running when he's released, goes back to Florida, takes his profits and reinvigorates his boat building business with his brother, and he builds boats and stays out of trouble until he dies in 1948. So McCoy's first customers are fishermen, people, farmers, people with a boat, recreational people who just want to have booze at home or have drinks with their friends at parties and things. But these people are quickly pushed out by professionals because gangsters realize that there's huge profit potential, and they basically take over the business. And one of the first people to do that, this is McCoy again on Arethusa. One of the first people to start pushing out the amateurs is Al Capone, who starts out his criminal career by running the bootlegging operation in Amityville. And he does so well that he's promoted and sent out to Chicago, and you know the rest of that story. But he's controlling bootlegging in Amityville when he's only 19. So in the beginning, as I mentioned, there's only a few prohibition agents with sort of second-class boats trying to catch the Rumrunners, who usually have better, faster boats. But there was some successes, like one day in July of 1922, the prohibition agents captured 3 large vessels carrying rum in one day off of Long Island. But in 1924, things changed dramatically. The government decides the prohibition agents are outnumbered, so they officially bring the Coast Guard into the effort to regulate prohibition, and they give the Coast Guard a lot of money to buy new boats and hire and increase their staffing. And these are some of the new patrol boats that they build, which are relatively fast. The other thing they do that year is the government signs treaties with England, Canada, and other countries, and they move the territorial limit out from 3 miles to 12 miles, which means that the prohibition agents and the Coast Guard have a lot more room to chase the bootleggers and smugglers after they get the booze offshore. So you get into this kind of cat and mouse game. The Coast Guard builds more boats, faster boats, and the Rumrunners go to local boat yards and say, okay, the Coast Guard's now going X miles an hour, we need to go faster. And what the Rumrunners and the boat builders do for them is something the Coast Guard never comes up with, which is after World War I, there's a lot of fighter aircraft surplus engines made by the Liberty, called Liberty engines. They generate 400 horsepower or more, and the boat builders start to figure out how to put them into the rum running boats, so they can really go faster. And they also start doing evasive tactics like pouring oil into the exhaust manifolds of their boats so they can create a smoke screen and get away. So the most famous boatyard that's building not only Coast Guard patrol boats, but faster rum running boats is this one, the Freeport Point Boatyard in Freeport, founded in 1922 by 2 brothers, Fred and Mike Skopanich. They built more than 30 rum running boats, and they played both sides because they also built 15 Coast Guard vessels designed theoretically to catch them, but they were never fast enough to really do that most of the time. This was down on the Nautical Mile. It's now a condo complex on the site, marked by this original sign. This is Fred's son, Fred Jr., who's still a boat builder out east. And in a great oral history, Fred Jr. talked about what his father and uncle were doing during Prohibition. He said, quote, "They knew the Coast Guard boats were going about 26 miles an hour, so they made the rum running boats to go near 30 loaded. They were making rum runners for everybody, and that meant from cops to elected officials to the gangster Dutch Schultz, who operated out of Patchogue and ultimately controlled most of the illegal booze operations on Long Island." This is Dutch, and if you were somebody interested in moving booze around on Long Island, I don't think you'd want to cross this guy when you look at those eyes. So initially, the Skopanich brothers were building 40-foot skiffs, such as a boat called Wanda, launched in 1926 with a single 500 horsepower Liberty engine, and the thing could fly at about 40 knots. But as the Coast Guard got better boats, they upped their ante, and eventually they were building boats like Maureen, 52-footer, completed in 1929, and it had 3 of those engines in it. This is one of the boats that survived Prohibition and became rebuilt as a cabin cruiser. The guys doing this business made no attempt to hide what they were up to. When they built Maureen/Gala, they put a bulletproof pilot house on it, and Bill Klebe of Baldwin, who was the owner, told the federal census canvasser in 1930 that he was a plumber. It never explained why he had a bulletproof windows on his cockpit. A lot of these people that were doing the rum running were not particularly old salts. My favorite one was a young man named Fred Pitts from Montauk, who was only 14 when a quote-unquote benefactor put him at the helm of an 85-foot speedster equipped with 3 of the Liberty V-shaped engines. He went back and forth with one crewman who happened to be his best friend, who was only 12. So Pitts would make this 45-mile runs out to Rum Row and back for 3 years. And he never had to worry about going to the right boat and getting the right load, because his benefactor would give him half of a $2 bill. And when he got out to Rum Row, he would find what he thought was the right boat. And then he and the captain of the supply vessel would hold their 2 halves of the $2 bill. And if it matched, then they knew they were dealing with the right person. So Pitts would pick up the booze, he would take it back and drop it off a beach at a beach in Montauk, where it would be transported to a ranch that's now called the Deep Hollow Ranch, which is the oldest ongoing ranch in the history of the country. Every time Pitts came in, he would get paid $400 per trip, which is the equivalent of $6,000 in current money. So the biggest risk, obviously, to the rum runners was the Coast Guard and the Prohibition agents, but Mother Nature could play a role, or just bad luck, which was the case with this tugboat called the Lizzie D. It sank off of Long Beach in October of 1923, taking all 8 crewmen down with her. The vessel's owner filed a marine casualty report with the federal government, stating that the 84-foot tug was on a, quote, cruise of the Narrows, close quote, and was not carrying any cargo. Nobody knew anything different until July of 1977, when a dive boat went out and Captain John Larson went down with his customers to 80 feet of water to explore the Lizzie D. And they found that the statement that there was no cargo was a great misstatement, because the ship was fully loaded with rye and whiskey bottles from Prohibition. Here, this is from an exhibit on Prohibition out at the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook a couple of years ago. You can see bottles from the Lizzie D in a crewman's boots. Here's a close-up. It's one of the favorite dive sites for Long Island scuba divers like me. And you can find one of these empty bottles on my shelf behind me. Some of the people that got out there years before I did actually found full bottles, and you can see a couple of them here. And occasionally somebody will crack open one of those bottles and share it around. And you have whiskey that's, if the bottle, sometimes the pressure will push the cork in and flood the bottle, but if the cork remains intact and the whiskey is not diluted, the people that have tried it says it's great because it's been maturing since 1923. The most of the booze that would either come ashore on the main beaches of Long Island, or it might come across on the barrier beaches, but some of it would be sold to or stored temporarily on the bay houses out in the middle of the Great South Bay. And these were built by fishermen and duck hunters. And so they have a base of operations, so they wouldn't have to come to shore every day. But they became a perfect sort of way station for illegal booze until it was needed ashore. And then sometimes there were Meadow Island out there was big enough to have hotels, and they became big speakeasies because nobody would ever bother them. So most of the rum running is going small vessels and either stocking places like this or local speakeasies, or moving into New York to bigger scale customers. But occasionally it wasn't just these small, fast rum runners that were involved. You'd have large ships. The best example of that is this lumber schooner called the William P. Bell. And it routinely ran from Norfolk, Virginia to New York carrying lumber, except one day in February of 1927, it was caught in a winter storm out in Long Island Sound, and the ship was encased in ice. The sails could not be managed. They couldn't even steer the ship. So it washed up on the beach by a bluff in Bayville. It was seen by a fireman, and as it was starting to wash towards the beach, he ran and got two more firemen. And when the ship washed up on the beach, they managed to get a line out to the ship, and then the 8 crewmen used that line to work their way off the ship and up to the bluff where the firemen were. And they were pretty bad shape from being out in the cold and the ice storm. So the firemen took them to a local house and they thawed them out, gave them some booze and food. And then when the people in the house weren't looking, the 8 crewmen just ran away, which the firemen thought was strange, but they couldn't explain it till the next day when the storm abated and people could get out and check out the ship. What they found was it wasn't full of lumber; it was full of whiskey casks. So you would think that somebody would call the police or the Coast Guard and say, "Hey, there's a big rum running ship on the beach." But human nature being what it was, nobody did that. They spent 3/4 of the day helping themselves to casks of whiskey. Initially, it's just local people, but there was a bootlegging gang in Bayville. They heard about it. They came and shooed away everybody else and started helping themselves. And this goes on for the into the middle of the second day, when finally, after 250 kegs have been taken away with 5,000 gallons of malt whiskey worth $250,000 in Prohibition dollars. At that point, a local policeman finally shows up, chases everybody else away, and he calls the Coast Guard. So they show up and they start checking out the cargo and making plans of what to do with it. This becomes major news initially on Long Island, then in New York City and the rest of the country and all around the world, because this is a huge, one of the biggest rum running discoveries ever. So the New York Times does the story the next day with a tongue-in-cheek headline that says, "Rum ship wrecked, townsfolk save crew, then brave raging sea to share in the liquor." So by the time the authorities get there, there's 125 kegs of liquor still left on the Belle, which they remove. Then the Coast Guard sends 2 cutters to try to tow the ship off the beach, and they can't make it budge. So then somebody in the Coast Guard has the brilliant idea of trying to blow up the ship. When you see how big that is, you can realize it's a stupid idea. It's not going to work, but they try it. They put 100 pounds of dynamite into the hull, get everybody away from it, and explode the dynamite. So you have this rather dramatic picture, but all it does is basically blow out some of the deck and interior structure, and the hull is really not even damaged. So at this point, the Coast Guard hires a couple of salvage tugs, and they're able to pull the William T. Bell off the beach at high tide. Meanwhile, the story is all over the world. This is the front page of a newspaper in Rome, which has done their own engraving showing the Bell being exploded by the beach. So this is what's left after the explosion, and the ship is still fairly intact. If you look down here, you can see one of the salvage tugs. So the interesting mystery is nobody knows what happens to the Bell after they get it off the beach. The presumption is because it's such a wreck that they would have taken it out to deep water in the middle of the Sound and sunk it, and nobody's ever found it. And the other possibility would be that they towed it someplace and broke it up for scrap. But nobody has any records in the Coast Guard or anywhere else about what happened to the Bell. So the fate of the ship after the salvage is still unknown. Now, another large ship that was involved in rum running was out in Montauk. On February 1932, 11 men were arrested as rum runners when their Canadian ship, the Algae, grounded on Shagwan Reef near Montauk Point, carrying between $75,000 and $200,000 worth of rye and Scotch whiskey. The men protested that they were Canadians, they were in international water, although they weren't that far out, and they hadn't done anything wrong, and the ship only ended up washing up on the reef because the ship was in distress. They claimed they were going from Canada to Bermuda when the ship sprung a leak, and they had to come to shore to save the ship. According to the Brooklyn Times Union, Commander Ryan of the Coast Guard laughed at their claims, saying the Algae had been known as a rum runner and had been chased repeatedly. Commander Ryan said the ship grounded because they were trying to slip into Fort Pond Bay to land their cargo. And this is a picture of Coast Guard men taking the cargo off one of their vessels and putting it on the dock in Montauk. But most of the Rumrunners with these small, fast boats like the Maureen. This is one of the more famous ones. Artemis, which was built in Greenport in 1929, had 3 of the 12-cylinder Liberty engines that allowed the boat to exceed 45 miles an hour. Artemis was kind of famous because it rammed a Coast Guard boat in a chase in 1931. And that boat that it rammed was a previous Rumrunner called the Black Duck that had been captured by the Coast Guard in another battle. And here you can see the Black Duck in the foreground, painted gray after the Coast Guard captured it. So Artemis ends up in a gun battle with the Coast Guard, gets away. The Coast Guard figured it couldn't have gone far, so they're checking all the harbors around the Sound and around the East End, and they catch up to it. They find it in the Port Jefferson boatyard with the hull riddled with bullet holes, and they capture it and turn it into Coast Guard service. So the game is getting more and more deadly, but the Rumrunners have to stay ahead of the game. So they keep coming up with new tricks. And my favorite one is initially they're bringing full cases of booze ashore, and as the Coast Guard gets more efficient in chasing them, they take the bottles out of the crates out on Rum Row, put them in burlap bags with a big block of salt and cork. If they're getting chased by the Coast Guard and they don't think they can get away, what they do is throw these burlap bags overboard. The weight of the salt carries it down, and it's out of sight, and there's no evidence to arrest them. What they do is wait a couple of days, and they go back to where they were, at which point the black salt has been dissolved by the salt water, and the cork brings the bottles back to the surface where they can retrieve them and bring them to the beach and sell them. So, as I said, most of the booze coming ashore is trucked away or even taken on the Long Island Railroad or occasionally by seaplane into the city. Some of it is consumed locally, in people's houses or local bars, but there's also a few major speakeasies around Long Island that are pretty widely known. One of them is Frank Freedy's Inn in headwaters of the Nisququogue River in Smithtown. That's now been long gone. Now it's a county park. The Canoe Place Inn in Southampton is still there. In fact, it's just being restored after being closed for many years. And this was a well-known speakeasy. Everybody knew about it, and all the authorities knew about it, and they never raided it because a lot of VIPs went there to drink, including Governor Al Smith. And nobody wanted to be in the embarrassing position of raiding the place when the governor might be there drinking. My favorite big speakeasy was Claudio's Restaurant in Greenport, which advertises itself as the oldest continuously operating restaurant in the country. And if you're going to be involved in smuggling booze, you're in the perfect location because the restaurant is built on pilings right over the water. So during Prohibition, at low tide, the rum running boats would come in, go right under the restaurant, and they had a trapdoor behind the bar. They could literally pull up under the trapdoor and just hand the booze right up to the bartenders. This is a picture of the interior back in that era. And if you go out there and go into the restaurant and look behind the bar, you can still see the trapdoor, and the bartenders are very happy to show that off to people. So rum running is primarily on the South Shore, a little bit up on the North Shore and the East End. But the busiest place for rum running in all of Long Island was Long Beach. It's a major population center, a lot of good quick transportation links by train and road to New York City. But the main reason Long Beach becomes the biggest center of rum running is because the police commissioner, Grossman, is in on the take. He's actually in league with the Rumrunners and actually organizes all the smuggling of booze throughout the city. He's got most of the police department and other employees involved in his operation. And what he does is when the Rumrunners are offshore, waiting when the coast is clear and there's no Coast Guard or anybody that's not in on the take is around. He will send an employee up into the clock tower of the old city hall to put a lantern out through a window, and that's the signal for the Rumrunners that they can bring the booze into the beach. He eventually is arrested, but indicted, but is not convicted because I guess he had a lot of friends in high places. But the enforcement and prosecution is kind of spotty. In 1935, Long Beach police officers were charged with unsuccessfully offering a bribe to a Coast Guard officer to let them land booze. Out in Greenport, there were several rum running boats tied up on the railroad dock on one side of the dock, and on the other side of the dock, the Coast Guard vessels were there, and they go out during the day and or night and shoot at each other. But when they were docked, they'd all socialize together. In Freeport, the Rumrunners and the Prohibition agents were particularly chummy. They gathered every afternoon after chasing each other around out on the bay at Otto St. George's restaurant, which opened in 1929 and is still down there on Nautical Mile. And they would chat and drink illegal booze together. Coast Guard Captain Frank Stewart was charged with accepting $2,000 in bribes, the equivalent of a year's pay, to let fishing boats land liquor in Montauk. And then the Coast Guard officer in charge of the Georgica station in East Hampton was sentenced to a year in jail in 1932 for cooperating with the Rumrunners. But there were honest cops, including retired Patchogue cop Roland Baker, who said in oral history that there were a lot of bootleggers around here. They would offer police officers $25 when they were off duty at night to come and help unload the liquor at a local creek, but I did not get involved in that. Life could be dangerous, both for law enforcement and smugglers, because it was a pretty competitive field. The headline in the Santa Mauritius Record in May of 1932 reads, "Coast Guard shot in rum seizure." The as I mentioned, Dutch Schultz was controlling most of the rum running. He did not take it kindly if somebody tried to bootleg or hijack his liquor. The penalty for that would be death. One person who ran afoul of the operation was a gangster named Sam Grossman from Brooklyn. They found his body on a quiet road in Brightwaters with 3 bullets in his head. Also in Brightwaters, another bootlegger named Arthur, nicknamed Happy Whalen Waring, was found by a clamor floating in the bay off of Brightwaters. He had been tied to a big lawnmower, but it failed to keep his body submerged. So Prohibition was much a failure from day one, and it was repealed in 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment. But even before that, there were so many people involved in the business that the profit margin kept dropping. So a lot of people dropped out even before Prohibition was repealed. I showed you Maureen, which became Gala. A lot of these vessels, because they were fast and well built, had lives long after Prohibition. In 1947, when the Fire Island Ferries Company was established, the owners were scrambling to get a fleet together so they could get out and carry passengers as quickly as possible. So when they began operating the next year, they had 4 vessels, one of which was the Fire Island, this is celebrating the end of Prohibition. One of them was the Fire Island Miss, which was a former rum runner. And then I showed you Artemis, that was in the gun battle. That continued life after the Coast Guard use became a ferry known as the South Bay Courier. And then we also have Fire Island Miss in a later version after being rebuilt with a second deck. So that's the story. Is Artemis as South Bay Courier in its days as a Fire Island ferry. So that's the story. No more smuggling after Prohibition. The next kind of episode, anything like this, comes in World War II when Nazi saboteurs are landed in Amagansett. So that's the end of the story. And what I'm going to do is stop the share and see if anybody has any questions. we have a lot of chats, which I'll check. I should mention what you heard is 2 chapters out of the 30 chapters in my latest book called Long Island and Sea, which you can get at your library or any other library on Long Island. Every bookstore on Long Island carries it, and you can also get it online at Amazon and other places. If you're particularly interested in the topic, if you email me at billblyer@gmail.com, I sell signed and inscribed copies directly. So you can email me if you're interested for the details. Also, you can email me if you want to be on my mailing list about other lectures, because I have 7 lectures in rotation. And an 8th one will be starting on the cult perspiring when that book comes out in May. All right, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions live. And in the meantime, I have a look at the chat, see what we have here. That's true. It's a webinar. I forgot it's a webinar, so you can't unmute yourself. So let's go through the chats. A lot of suggestions on how to get the PowerPoint operating. Thank you for that. Okay. Okay, people ask if this is being recorded. Yes, it's being recorded and streaming live on YouTube. Okay. People didn't know this was going on in their backyard. It's a very interesting topic. Okay, I don't see any questions, so just questions. Email address is Bill Blyer, BLEYER @gmail.com. Okay, question. This just came up on Facebook. I post all my lectures, by the way, on the Long Island History Facebook page and also on my own Facebook pages, and there are pages for all my books. Question. I know the answer because I just was talking to the Huntington Town historian about this. Were there catacombs under the streets of Northport? This is a big rumor that goes, you hear this for almost every community on Long Island, that there were secret tunnels, from the harbor into the town so they could smuggle booze. None of this has ever been proven. I mean, there's been tunnels for various things, usually for drainage. And I can't rule out that somebody might have tried to bring booze up through these drainage tunnels, but they're not that big, and it's just a lot easier to put it in a truck. So I think this is, sort of more of a legend that people like to pass on. Okay, let's see. A lot of questions coming in now. Okay, no catacombs. Do you feel the book Pirate Hunter is pretty accurate or close? I have not seen it, unfortunately. There's a lot of misinformation about pirates. And what I told you tonight is the most accurate story that I can determine. Did the Gardner family keep any treasure besides the silk? No. The Governor Bellamont his emissary was pretty careful to get everything back, and they had a good inventory because Captain Kidd was cooperating, trying to save his life. So they knew they had a pretty good list of what was out there. So and apparently the silk fabric was really large. Right now, there's only a small swatch on it framed on the wall. Is the book for sale at a bookstore in Greenport? It may be. It might be for sale at Preston's. They used to have a really good book department, but they don't anymore. But I know it's in Bookhampton, and it's pretty much, it's in Sag Harbor. Book Review has it. Pretty much any big bookstore on Long Island carries it. Off topic, curious if you watched or enjoyed the show Turn about the Revolution Wants to Talk It. The main reason I decided to do a book on the Culper spy ring is because there is huge amount of misinformation about the spy ring. There is legends that are considered fact. There is just speculation that's turned into fact. When I was still working at Newsday, when Turn came out, and I did a story for the paper about the historical accuracy of the show and trashed it because it's a joke. They turn Tories into patriots and vice versa. I go into this in great detail. The book is interesting because it's an analytical history. What I've done is taken all the versions of what people have said, both in turn, different authors, and basically go through it, pick it all apart. And Turn gets a lot of trash from me because there's just a lot of nonsense in the book. I'll make you wait until May for that lecture to get to specifics. I also thought it was bad. It was just bad drama. It bothered me. AMC sent Newsday review copies so we could write about it in advance. And the first mention of spying didn't happen for 45 minutes into the first episode. And they spent all this time sort of doing a Peyton Place setup of Abraham Woodhull having a non-existent romance with Anna Strong, who was many years older, happily married with 6 children. They hired Alexander Rose, who wrote what was considered the definitive book until mine, I guess, on spying as their consultant. They bought the rights to the book, and then they ignored a lot of the history and just to jazz it up. And the only good thing I can say about Turn is it generated a lot of interest in the spying, including among the history press, which kept bugging me to do a book. And after turning it down, because I said there's lots of other books, I finally realized I could do one that would be different, and did it. Okay, let's see, anything else? Very interesting. Please do more lectures. As I said, I have 7 lectures in rotation. I've done some for your library out here. If you look on the Long Island history page, I put them up, or you can get on my mailing list. They sort of do them all in rotation. Did you say that Claudio's was the oldest speakeasy on Long Island? Claudio's is the oldest continuously operating restaurant in the country. And it was one of the major speakeasies on Long Island. Not necessarily the oldest, it's the oldest restaurant in the country. Okay, I think that is the last question. So if you have any follow-ups, questions, or you're interested in the book or anything else, you can always email me or message me on Facebook. So with that, I thank you for hanging in with the technical difficulties, and I hope to see you all on another lecture.
Thanks so much, Bill. That was terrific.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ward.
Have a great night, everybody.
Okay, take care, folks.